everyone. So I want to talk a little bit about biodiversity. And when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about numbers of species. Later in class, we're going to talk about how you actually go from this natural selection or non-adaptive evolution mechanism to actually creating new species. So here are all the different numbers of species for different phyla. And what's interesting about this table is that these are actually just the described species. So these totals would be much higher if they included undescribed species. The process of actually describing and cataloging a species is pretty extensive. You have to see it a certain number of times, you have to describe it a certain way, you have to name it a certain way. So sometimes even newly discovered species are not officially described. When we talk about biological wealth, we're talking about the numbers of different species. And a lot of times when we're trying to think of even just animal species, we often think of mammals, like fuzzy things like dogs, cats, etc. in terms of different animal species. But actually it's insects. You can see right here, insects make up the majority of all of our species. Other animals are right here, and then mammals would actually just be a small chunk of that other animal piece of the pie. So invertebrates, right, things that don't have a backbone, are actually most of animal diversity. Things that we think of as animals, like mammals, even like lizards, stuff like that, are actually a very small percentage of animal diversity. When we think of biodiversity, we often just think of the number of species, like how many species actually exist in the area that we're looking at. But there are a couple different measures of biodiversity. So one measure of biodiversity is the species richness. And species richness is the number of species in an area. So you can see in each of these two different communities, there are 4 different species. So the species richness for these communities would be 4. Species evenness, on the other hand, is the proportion, the relative proportion of each species. So both Community 1 and Community 2 have the same species richness. They both have 4 different species. But Community 1 is actually more biodiverse because it has greater species evenness, meaning that those 4 different species are more equal in proportion to each other, rather than Community 2 where the proportions are unequal. So high species evenness means that the proportions of the species are more equal to each other. When we do our next lab, we are going to measure species richness and species evenness, and therefore biodiversity, because biodiversity is a combination of species richness and species evenness. In a minute, we're going to talk about why we actually value species, and why we should value species. But for right now, I want to talk briefly about why biodiversity is declining. Right, so biodiversity is declining, and it's declining for a number of reasons, and those reasons can actually be summed up in an acronym, HIPPO, H-I-P-P-O. So the H stands for habitat loss, or habitat destruction. The I stands for invasive species. The P stands for pollution. The other P stands for population, so population increase of humans. And then the O stands for overexploitation. And we'll talk about a couple of these right now, but then we're going to talk about more of them as we're going to talk about invasive species, pollution, and population more so later on in the year. So one of our first reasons for decline, for biodiversity decline, is habitat change or habitat loss. And that habitat change or loss can happen in a variety of different ways. The first is conversion. So this is where we take a natural habitat and we make it into something else. So for example, if you take a forest, chop it all down, and make it into a parking lot for a shopping mall, That would be conversion. You have converted that natural habitat into another purpose. Or you take a forest and you convert it into an agricultural field. That's conversion. Next would be fragmentation, which we talked a little bit about, and right here, this Yosemite National Park is an example of fragmentation. This is where we take a natural ecosystem and we start building roads that split it into pieces, right? So here's another example of roads kind of splitting this habitat into pieces, right? So, and if you remember, fragmentation, so when we split habitats into pieces, we get the edge effect. And this is where you increase the number of species that can live in these edge habitats, and you decrease that interior habitat and that interior species. The next type of habitat change is simplification. So simplification is where we kind of streamline a natural habitat. And this can be literal, like we take this natural stream and we want it to move more point A to point B and we channel it. So we get rid of a lot of habitats in that way. So the simplification, by channeling that stream, we have simplified that habitat because now it's all one type of habitat. It used to be all these riffles and pools and different types of habitats, and now it's all just this channeled stream. It's all the same. We all do habitat simplification when we rake the leaves in our yard. We are raking up those leaves or picking up dead logs, and then we're getting rid of that natural decaying process. And that natural decaying process can actually create habitat for other organisms, and it is pushing nutrients back into the soil through that decomposition. So we are simplifying our habitats in that way. Last is intrusion, and up here this cell phone tower is an example of intrusion, and this is where we are building something up into a habitat. So this could be something where we're building these cell phone towers or really, really tall buildings, and we're putting those in these paths that the birds might take, and then now they have to take a different path or risk crashing into it. Could also be a long pier that extends into a aquatic habitat, right? So intruding in that habitat. The I in hippo stands for invasive species. So these are non-native species that get introduced, and these introductions can be accidental by carrying something with you when you travel or ship something, or they could be deliberate introductions where you're trying to grow something or raise something. This could be like aquaculture or horticulture. And we're going to talk later about why invasive species are so destructive. Invasive species have to be non-native and they have to be harmful. So these are species that are increasing in these huge proportions and then sort of taking over the ecosystem. Actually, one of the most dangerous and most harmful invasive species are cats. Cats kill so many songbirds worldwide that they have become an invasive species in among themselves. And we'll talk about some other ones later on, like the lionfish, like the zebra mussel, and then even some rodents. The first P in the HIPPO acronym is for pollution. And pollution kind of encompasses a lot of different things, and we're going to talk about pollution a lot this winter. There's a lot of different types of pollution, from nutrient pollution to plastic pollution to air pollution. So we will get into all those different types of pollution later on. Next up is population increase. That's our second P. And we will talk about population increase and human population growth later on. What's interesting about the population piece of the HIPPO acronym is that there are some that argue that population increase is the only reason for the decline in biodiversity. And if you think about it, the greater the population, the more habitat has to be lost, right, or change or converted or fragmented. The greater the population, the more likely that invasive species are going to be transported during travel. Greater the population, the more pollution you're going to have because more people to pollute. And then also the greater the population, potentially the greater overexploitation of resources, which is this next piece. So last up is this overexploitation of resources that we talked a little bit about when we did the tragedy of the commons. And this is where you overharvest, right? So you're taking too much of a particular species. And this accounts for actually 23% of our recent extinctions. And actually, a trade in exotics has become the third largest illicit income source behind drugs and guns, and this makes about $12 billion a year. Right? So the reason I put Finding Nemo here is because after the first Finding Nemo movie came out, people started buying a lot of clownfish. This wasn't a huge problem because clownfish can be raised in captivity. But then later, when Finding Dory came out, people started to buy blue tangs. And blue tangs can actually not be raised in captivity. So they were being taken off the reef. And if you've ever seen Finding Nemo, sort of the point of the movie was lost in this. There are other more black market types of trades that are harmful, like the ivory trade. And we will talk more about illegal trade later. All right, so why should we value wild species in the first place? Within wild species, all wild species have both instrumental value and intrinsic value. So instrumental value is where this species has some use. So that species has some direct use where it's benefiting us in some way or it's benefiting its ecosystem in some way. Intrinsic value is a little bit harder to wrap your head around because this is where it has value simply because it exists. Right, so we don't really have the right to say it doesn't have value, or we don't have the right to put value on it because all living things have value just because they exist. Whereas instrumental value, again, has some type of use for its ecosystem or for us. And usually sometimes like the benefit to the ecosystem can be an indirect benefit to us. So one type of instrumental value can be food and raw materials. Right? So maybe we like a species because it provides food for us. For example, we forage for fiddleheads and my husband hunts wild deer. Right? So that is providing food for us. Or it could be raw materials as well, like timber. Right? Beyond that, too, it's good to have wild genes, right? And we actually will bank genes. We bank seed genes by putting them in these seed vaults, like this one in Norway, right? And we bank animal genes using zoos, right? And by banking those genes, having these seed banks or having these zoos, if we get a loss in biodiversity in the natural environment, we then have those wild genes as sort of a backup. Maybe we can have new food plants or we can restore the ecosystem in some way. A couple other more instrumental values, these are where it has some use for us, are medicinal or recreation. Right, so there are a lot of plants that have medicinal values for us. A lot of our medicines that we use now have originally come from some kind of plants. The original chemotherapy drug Taxol came from the Pacific yew tree. There are pain medicines that come from opioids that come from tropical plants. Right? There's also instrumental value in recreation. Right, so this recreational instrumental value, this has some direct use for us. This could include hiking, like on Mountain Day, or it could just include being able to go out on a boat and enjoy a habitat in that way, or being able to go fish, and however you recreate in the natural environment. Even skiing itself, too. Another type of instrumental value that's often not well thought of is the scientific value, and this is where we can make discoveries and then use those discoveries for our own benefit. A great example of this is the mantis shrimp. So you should all go YouTube videos of mantis shrimp because it has the fastest punch, the fastest strike that has ever been recorded. And it punches with this little spring-loaded club. And what's kind of neat about that instrumental value is it was a discovery-based science. So the lady that researched these shrimp didn't really know what she would find, and started looking at them and then found this super punch where they will actually cavitate, like super boil the water and split it. And then that super boiled water sort of collapses in on itself and creates these mini explosions. And she was looking at why the club of the shrimp doesn't degrade given that it's doing this super punch all the time. And now she's using that research to inform decisions about armor for the army. So that in itself could be a scientific value that has direct use for us. All right, now if you look at these two pictures, if we talk about having value just for its own sake, if you look at these two pictures, the picture on the left I want you to think about whether or not you could assign intrinsic value to that. It is valuable just because it exists. Cute little panda bear. And then look at this disgusting bug on the right that is my least favorite thing on this planet. This is called a silverfish. It's like a centipede. And I want you to decide whether or not you could place intrinsic value on this disgusting bug, right? This silverfish centipede. I guess it's an insect, right? So this is value that is independent of any benefit to humans, right? So thinking about both of these two species, it might be easier to place intrinsic value on this cuddly panda bear and thinking about how it could be important to preserve versus this silverfish that can jump up to 1.5 feet and can live 1 year without food and is just disgusting. And I think we all tend to place intrinsic value as more easily given for things that are a bit more charismatic like the panda versus things that are a bit creepy like this silverfish. So just hold on to that for a minute. So I love this quote about intrinsic value, and I feel like it sums it up really well. With intrinsic value, we do need to place value on species purely because they exist, not because they have any known direct value, instrumental value for us. So destroying species is like tearing pages out of an unread book written in a language humans hardly know how to read about the place where they live. Right? We don't even know what species could mean to us eventually, right? And even beyond that, right? Why is it that humans are allowed to make those choices about what is valuable and what is not valuable? Another type of intrinsic value is religious value, right? So valuing species for some kind of religious reason. One example of this is the Chipko movement. The Chipko movement was a Hindu movement where they were trying to prevent loggers from cutting down all these trees, and these Hindu women would actually encircle the trees, and Chipko means to embrace, and this is actually where the term tree hugger came from, was these Hindu women kind of embracing these trees in order so that the loggers would not cut them down. In the Christian Bible, right, there's this one quote, and God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." What's interesting about this is that we often read that word dominion, and we see it as power, the use of power, having power over something, this authority over everything. But another meaning of the word dominion is the responsibility to protect. So I like to think of this dominion over all of the wild creatures as our responsibility to protect those ecosystems and those wild species. So we'll segue for a second and talk about your homework assignment. You are all going to think of a pest that you absolutely hate. Okay, so think of a good one. Think of one that you absolutely hate. Get that in your mind right now. Maybe write it down next to you. And what I want you to do is I want you to write me up, say, a paragraph about why I should not extinguish that species from the face of the earth. Right? So I want you to pretend like I want to extinguish that species, even though you hate it. It's like an absolute pest. It's your least favorite wild creature on the face of this earth, and you are going to defend its existence. And you can mostly defend its instrumental value and think about all the different instrumental values that we just talked about, or you can, or I should say, you should at least defend its instrumental value. But you could also take a shot at trying to defend its intrinsic value as well. We're not quite done yet. There's a couple more things I want to talk about, and that's a few acts that you need to know. So the first act that you need to know is the Lacey Act of 1900, or it's just called the Lacey Act. And this was a conservation law in the United States that prohibited trade in wildlife, fish, and plants that were illegally taken, possessed, transported, or sold. It seems kind of intuitive that you should not be able to trade illegally taken wildlife, but this Lacey Act has to do specifically with trading illegally taken wildlife. So this law, this is a U.S. law, a U.S. Act, and you are not allowed to not only not trade the entire plant, animal, product, or any of their parts or products. Right, so it's not just the wildlife itself, it's parts or products related to them. Later on, there was a bill to amend the Lacey Act in 1981, and they added this amendment, the Combat Illegal Logging Act, which prevented illegal logging practices and then trading those illegal logged trees. Another act that you really need to know is the Endangered Species Act of 1973. And this was key legislation for both domestic and international conservation. So this was a U.S. act, but it works for both domestic and international conservation. So the act aims to provide a framework to conserve and protect endangered and threatened species and their habitats. And when you're trying to designate an animal as endangered or threatened, you have to list it in the endangered species list, right? And a species that gets added to the list can be because of any of the following factors. It could be because its habitat is under threatened destruction. It could be that it's being overutilized for commercial, recreational, scientific, educational purposes. Could be because of disease or predation. It could be because of inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms or any other natural or man-made factors affecting its survival. An endangered species can be listed through the Endangered Species Act by a petition process or through a candidate assessment process. And any interested party can petition the Secretary of the Interior or the Secretary of Commerce to add a species or remove a species from the endangered species and threatened species list. Although service biologists are usually identifying these species as listing candidates. When you do list a species as endangered or threatened, or you petition or propose a species as endangered or threatened, you also have to consider a few things. You have to consider what the critical habitat is, what amount of habitat, where does this habitat have to be in order for that species to best be able to thrive. And then you have to come up with a recovery plan. So you have to come up with what you think the next steps need to be for that species to be able to fully recover. If you're interested in looking up more about this, there is the IUCN Red List. And this lists most species and it gives them some kind of tag as extinct in the wild, critically endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, or least concerned. And this is a red list. It's available online. Last one is CITES. So this is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. This is a multilateral treaty to protect endangered plants and animals. And this is specifically looking at international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants. This can be pretty critical because even if you just look at ivory, it's one thing to ban the hunting of elephants in one area, but then if you're also have an international agreement where you're banning that trade, it's harder for that ivory to move from country to country and for that to be okay. So even if it's killed in Africa but moved to Asia, like both of those things are banned, so there's a bit more regulatory process involved. And that is it for now.